When I was in high school, particularly the time I grew up and being in the South, I had many teachers that were very religious, some even that I went to church with. There's three, though, specifically that I recall when I think about faith. The first of these was Larry. Larry held a Bible study at his church once a week that many students at the church, at the school, attended. And I found out about this from a fellow friend who had graduated within the past couple of years and invited me to go to one of these Bible studies. And this was very much a big part of my first year in high school, going to these. And at the end of the year, there was a conversation raised about a friend of mine, about somebody that I knew very well running track with. And the response that Larry gave about this person in this conversation was one that had a lot of prejudice to it. It reminded me in many ways of one of his parables with one of the Pharisees, who in prideful piousness says that at least he's not like this person. And that moment was one of the first of many that made me realize maybe I didn't want to keep going to this Bible study. And as I began my second year in high school, I ended up breaking my foot at the beginning of the year, the beginning of cross-country season. So that was a really good time for me to bow out. Now, I learned a year or so later that academically this actually wasn't the best decision, because those who attended this Bible study ended up doing a little bit better on the essay portions of our exams. Now, Larry ended up leaving teaching soon after, in part because of conflicts with the new administration of the school, which he was very public in speaking out against. And Larry ended up going into full-time ministry, even starting his own program. And again, what I would learn years and years later is that the board of this group had asked Larry to step down. It turns out he'd been using some funds to buy things like a boat and had an affair with a young woman who was about the same age as his son. Now, another of these teachers was Bill Warren. And Bill was somebody who had a strong faith, and this was very well known in the school. But Bill never flaunted it. He treated all students, whether they were Christian or not, with respect. And while he didn't stuff religion down people's throats, he was always more than happy to discuss his faith with anyone who had questions about it. Now, Bill was a classics teacher and wasn't afraid to delve into non-religious subjects. He actually taught some extracurriculars on Greeks and philosophy. And these were a big influence on me. They were a huge part of why I went to St. John's with their Great Books program. Bill was a mentor to me, even beyond high school. He too left teaching, although quite a bit later, to go into full-time ministry and he is still doing that work to this day. And finally, there was a teacher named Devin. And when I broke my foot during that sophomore year, I spent a lot of time in a wheelchair, so I didn't have a lot of mobility. I couldn't really get around easily. This had an impact on me at lunch, and Devin was one of the folks who would come over quite frequently and sit with me just so that I'd have somebody there at lunch. Now, at the time, I didn't know Devin's thoughts about religion. He was a mathematics teacher. It wasn't really something that came up. And whenever he would sit down with me, he would take some time, be silent, close his eyes, and after a little bit of time would open them and start eating. He was praying. He was giving thanks for the meal that he had in front of him. And he didn't do so in a very public or showy way. He was reverent and prayerful, but didn't make a big deal about that. And what spoke to me, in addition to that devotion that I saw, was the kindness that he extended to me. And I was nowhere near one of his best students in class, so it was not anything like that. It was just a kind act from somebody to another who was having a hard time, who couldn't move around the way he used to. The way most people in the high school really do. Now, in all of these examples, we see the impact when it comes to faith of ego. Now, Bill and Devin were both able to put theirs aside. While Bill was very open about his faith, he did so in a way that was always respectful to others, never forceful. He was willing to live, to have conversations with others in the world. But Devin lived out his faith too, even though the way he did so was not always obvious and overt. And he too was respectful to others and acted out his faith in the kindness he showed others in the world. Now, today we hear these words from Paul. I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. And this is Paul calling us to not have inflated egos. He's calling us instead to be mindful not of ourselves, but in how we serve God. He asked us to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. And then we hear Paul list different roles for people in the church. He says that each member is the group, part of this group, this one body, each having different gifts. None of those gifts is better than the other. We need people to help be part of the leadership of our church. We need teachers, those who are knowledgeable, those who are licensed to do so. We need deacons. We need others. We're going out into the world and helping others and bringing those needs for those who need it. The sick, the poor, anyone in between that needs help. We need people to come back and bring those needs to us here in the church. We need people here every Sunday greeting and welcoming people. We need people helping us as we serve coffee and food at coffee hour. None of these gifts are things that we can do without in the church. We all have a part to play, and each of those parts is important. That's whether we think they are or not. It's when we reach for power in the church, for power's sake, that we fail to hear Paul's words, to hear his warnings. That's when it becomes about our ego, not about what God is calling us to do, how God is calling us to serve. When we focus on our ego, it's no longer about the Lord. And now we get a good example of this falling into ego from what we see in Pharaoh in Exodus this morning. Now, Pharaoh has forgotten what we heard even just last week from Genesis, that the Hebrews, that Joseph, one of these Hebrews, came in and helped the Egyptians through a great famine. He saved their lives. Yet Pharaoh has forgotten this week. He's fearful of these people that are growing, that are multiplying in his kingdom. And so he does everything he can to try to stand them down. But then we have Moses put in a basket on the river. And while Pharaoh's daughter, who sees him there, knows that he must be a Hebrew child, she still raises him as her own. Moses goes about unknown for who he is in Pharaoh's house until who he is as one of God's people is fully revealed. Now, in all things, Jesus is our great example, the example that we all should follow. And he, too, like Moses, goes unknown among the people. No one is quite sure who Jesus is. And we see this in the disciples' response to his question. Because when Jesus asked them who he is, the only answers that they give are what other people think about Jesus. It's only Peter who is able to correctly respond to who Jesus is, to that question Jesus poses. And in a preview of next week, what we'll see is that even with that statement, Peter doesn't quite know what Jesus' role actually is in the world. Jesus was not about ego, although he is the one person in the world who could have an ego. Jesus was content to travel in this world, unknown, as he was carrying out his mission. And because he is a great example to us, we should be willing to do so as well. When we inflate our own ego, our work, our mission becomes about us. And we see this in the example of even some around us. Those who grab for power, for their own wants and needs, are never the ones who are truly serving God. They are only serving themselves. We're not called to make the work about ourselves. And that's why Paul takes so much time to talk about the different roles in the church. He talks about those different roles so that we can discern what it is exactly that God is calling us to do. Not where we think there's going to be the most honor and power for ourselves. One of the things that's important for us to remember is that those who have an impact on our faith, sometimes even the most impact on our faith, are often the ones who do something that seems very little in a time when we need it, in a time when we need that support and love. So don't make your work about your own ego. Instead, make it about God. Make it about where God is calling you to serve, both in God's church and in the world.